Thank you for tuning in for the April edition of Forage Focus, your favorite show that's all about forages. I'm your host, Christine Gelley, and today our guest is Marcus McCartney, the ANR Educator for Washington County. He's going to talk with us about pasture fertility. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. It's April in Ohio, and we are ready to see those pastures greening up across the hillsides. To help you get the best use of your pasture, the first place to start is by correcting any fertility issues that you have. Our guest today, Marcus McCartney, is going to walk us through some tips on how to maximize productivity by first adjusting fertility. Marcus, thank you for joining us on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you come join us from Washington County. So that our viewers can get to know you, could you tell us a bit about what keeps you busy in your home county?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Christine, for letting me be here today. Washington County is very diverse. We have everything from dairy to beef to horticulture. You know, we have large fruit and vegetable producers. We've got forestry. It's every aspect of agriculture you could have all in one county. So it's very fun. It keeps me busy. One of the programs we're starting right now I'm passionate about is all of our youth gardening programs that are happening. We have a raised bed at the Boys and Girls Club, and we just started last week of our first session. We'll have 7 spring sessions followed by about 8 summer sessions, and the kids get really excited. You know, those are low-income families. We grow this produce. They get to take it home. Some of the food we do donate to a local food bank right beside the facility. And then we're going to be starting our junior farmers market, where we take farmers markets, actually a mobile market, to the schools where kids can buy fresh fruit and vegetables with money we give them.
That sounds really exciting, like a great opportunity for those kids.
Oh, it's fun. Introducing kids to fruit and vegetables at an early age is the right way to go.
I'm sure that you have a heavy 4-H presence in your county. Don't you have 3 fairs in Washington?
So we have 3 fairs. That's unusual, and the 3 fairs definitely keeps our county busy. So when it's fair season, that's pretty much all we get done is fairs.
What would you say is the most common livestock animal that they take to the fair?
I'd say sheep and goats.
Really?
The small ruminants. That's the largest numbers. Probably for the small ruminants, but the hogs, you know, that's probably the most. Or swine, we have over 200 usually at a Waterford fair, so we have over 200. So usually it's hogs, and followed by sheep or goats, and then we get down to the beef.
Well, spinning off of that, it sounds like there's a lot of people who might be getting started with small ruminants that don't have previous experience and may need to be working on improving the areas where they keep those animals, being their pastures.
Absolutely.
So when somebody walks into your office and says, I just got some sheep, I just got some goats, I really notice I have some problems in my pasture, what's the first thing that you tell them?
Well, very good question. I get that question quite a bit too. So we have a saying in Extension, you know, if someone brings in a bug or a plant that has disease, we don't give any recommendations until we identify it. So to me, the first step is identifying what's in your soil already. So the first step to me is soil testing. That should be the first step of pasture fertility, is knowing what you currently have nutrient-wise, what your pH is, and even organic matter in your soil. So when I talk about soil testing, I kind of think of 2 concepts. To me, it's consistency and representation. You know, we want our soil samples to be consistent from all the borings that we take, and we want our borings to be representative of the actual sample that we are of the field that we're trying to represent. For example, I'll go into one of those. There's 4 key elements to soil testing: the when, the where, the how deep, and how often. Well, when, you know, I worked at Wvu Soil Lab under Dr. James Gorman. He retired, I think, in 2015. Really knowledgeable. It was a great experience. I learned a lot from him. But according to him in WVU, usually the fall is the best time to take a soil sample. Usually that's right at the end of the growing season, and that's where your nutrient level is going to be the lowest. And as well, the labs typically aren't as busy. So, but rather if you take your soil samples in the spring or in the fall, I would stick with that consistency concept, but I'd always test in the spring if I test in the spring, or always continue to test in the fall if I test in the fall, so you can track those trends over time to see if your management of your nutrients is improving. So where is kind of the representation. So if I'm going to sample my pasture, and I have a slide here, I'll show different areas, but I want to make sure that that sample is consistent with the rest of the field. You know, I want to try to avoid maybe an eroded spot, because that one eroded spot is not going to be like the rest of the field. Or maybe I have an area that's just not as productive, or maybe a really low-lying area that's wet. Well, I would exclude those from my samples because they're not representative.
Marcus, before you go on, you brought some slides for us today that I think might be helpful for people to look at their field and try to decide how to divide it up. So, you know, there's obviously going to be those areas in every pasture that perform a little bit differently. So now that people know, okay, I need to do a soil test, and how do I do the soil test, do you think we should look at some of those slides and show them that
let's
division?
go ahead with some of the slides here. Okay, so there's soil testing, but here's an example of how to divide a field. You know, you got the whole field sampling, which I don't think is the best. You have grid sampling, which is pretty intensive and can cost a lot of money. And my favorite, and one I do personally and I recommend, is the zone sampling, where you're dividing the field up in different zones, whether that's topography, and that's what I typically go with, or the soil series. You could go with the production. You know, this area produces more, so that's a zone we'll sample separate than this area that doesn't produce as much. So zone sampling is what I like. On the screen here, it does show that, you know, not one area should exceed 25 acres, and to me that's part of the where as well. That may work for the western part of Ohio, but being from West Virginia, we have hills and we have mountains, and where we're at in Washington County is no different. We got a lot of hills. So I'd recommend not taking a sample that's larger than 10 acres.
Yeah, just because the consistency of our soils, for one, and then our topography and the conditions, you're not going to find 25 acres that's the same anywhere, I think, in the southeast corner of the state.
Absolutely.
Which is where we are. So I guess if you're outside that region and you do have 25 consistent acres, lucky you. But otherwise, we need to be thinking about smaller areas for those sample sizes, right?
Yes, absolutely. Now, if we get back to the slides for a second, I got one more, and this is a good example as well. So this is kind of like my field almost. I have a low spot in my field that I sample separate. Down the bottom it says low spot, and then there's another sample that says sample 2, so that was a eroded spot, so that's sampled all separately. And then of course the main, we see all the zigzag numbers, those are each individual borings, and those consist of your main field. So like I do, my low area, I sample it separate than the rest of the field, and usually the results are a little bit different, especially with the nutrients. My low area is right in a floodplain, so it does seem like the nutrient level is a little bit higher than the rest of the field. I do like the fact that it does say, you know, use a zigzag pattern, you know, for a field anywhere, you know, this says 15 on the screen, but I like the 20 to 25 cores, which I think would be excellent to get a good average representation.
What exactly is a core?
Good question. So a core, think about like, so we have soil probes. A core is like a boring. You know, if you have a soil probe, it goes down so deep into the soil, 6 inches, 4 inches, 2 inches. We'll talk about the depth. Or if we don't have a soil probe, it's taking a spade and it's getting a slice of that soil. And so a core is one slice. So you get that one slice or that one boring, that one core, and you put it into a plastic bucket, never metal, and then you go around the whole field until you get your 20, 25 cores. Then you mix all those together, and then from that mixing, you take about a cup of soil, which is about ½ pound, and that's what you bring to the extension office for us to melt in. I do like, it does mention, you know, 6 months after manure application. So if you throw manure down and you start to sample 2 months later, well, your results are going to be skewed. And the same thing after fertilizing as well. You know, your results will be skewed. And liming, same situation. If you lime and go test your soil, you need to wait a few months for everything to kind of work its way in the soil and do what it's supposed to do.
I mean, ideally, you would sample before you apply any fertilizer, right?
Absolutely. You would sample before, and that's our biggest saying is test, don't guess. So.
Right. I mean, it'd be a little odd to go ahead and put your fertilizer on and then find out that you used too much or you used too little and then just be all thrown off. So first step is come into the extension office, pick up that soil probe, and take it back out and get yourself a nice representative sample.
And the soil probe is free. So we loan out free soil probes. I have 3 at our office, and usually I accompany some instructions on how to take a quality soil sample. And part of that quality is when you're taking your bores, you don't want to send them in direct sunlight. You don't want to put them in an oven where they heat up. The best thing to do is put them in a cool spot in the shade, in your garage, and just let them dry naturally for a few days before you bring them in. Because when folks do bring in soil to the office, I'll tell them, well, if it's wet, I'm not going to send it. It's going to sit in my counter for at least 3 or 4 days till the water is evaporated out, because it costs to ship the water. And I don't want to ship the water because it's extra money.
And who knows how long that soil sample has been sitting before it made it to your office. There are living organisms in that soil, right, that could then start to have chemical reactions and degrade in the time between taking the sample and getting it to the lab. So the drier the better.
Yep, the drier the better. A little bit different literature when it comes to how deep. For permanent pastures, I've seen research that goes from anywhere from 3 to 4 inches. I know at WVU they recommend 2 inches for permanent pastures, but rather if you go 2 inches for your probes or your borings, your cores, or if you go 4 inches, keep it consistent. Always go down 4 inches or always go down 2 inches. You want to keep everything consistent. Let's go back to the slides again. And remember the representation. So we talked about, the western part of the state, you can probably get by with 25 acres in one sample. Here, we're Southeast Ohio, maybe 10 acres is the most. That is a lot of soil, because what you're sending, you're bringing in 1 pound or a half a pound, essentially. A cup of oil is a half a pound. So you're bringing that into the office, and that half a pound has to represent, in the case of 10 acres, 20 million pounds.
Wow.
So that's a lot. So being representative, that's why you want to try to avoid those eroded spots, because you want that sample to be as representative of that field as possible. So that's why I think important to go to how deep, keeping that consistency. And then how often is a question I get all the time. So how often do we soil test pastures? Well, at establishment, that's a given. Right before do establishment, always test. And then recommendations is every 3 to 4 years test your soil pasture soil. But I like to do, if I throw a bunch of nutrients down, test my soil in year 1, I'm gonna come back in year 2 and test again, just for the first 2 or 3 years, to see if my management style is paying dividends, to see if I'm gaining nutrients, my pH is where it has to be. Then after that 2 or 3 years, then I'll back off to the every 3 or 4 year recommendation.
And then, of course, if you're doing like an alfalfa rotation with something else, you'd want to do that every time you change crops too. I think sometimes people think of establishment versus rotation in different terms. So anytime that you're changing the crop, that would be considered a new establishment, and you'd want to test there also, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, but in this case, we're focusing on pastures.
Yes.
All right, so there's the screen here, and we do take it. Here's the consistency or representation, actually. This is the representation concept. So you think around where your cattle or your sheep or your goats or whatever are going to congregate. Those areas are going to be full of nutrients. So feeders, I wouldn't want to take a boring right around a feeder. I wouldn't want to take a boring right around where the water source is, mineral source, shade, because the animals will be there loafing, and that's where their manure is going to be heavily deposited. So I try to avoid those areas when testing my pasture. So we get a soil test. Here's what makes up your soil test. Soil pH, to me, is one of the most critical things you can do is your pH, making sure your pH is right. And then they'll test your cation exchange capacity, your CEC, how much nutrients can your soil hold. And then they test the extractable cations, which is calcium, magnesium, and potassium. Okay? And then they'll extract phosphorus as well. We use Spectrum Analytic in our county, so for our general test, that comes with organic matter. I like to see what the organic matter of the content is. Some labs will have buffer pH and some will not have pH. like WVU, they've kind of took their buffer pH off their soil lab, but they give you a lime recommendation. That's what the buffer pH is for, is to get that lime recommendation. So they kind of give it to recommendation. Everyone asks, what's buffer pH? Well, it's not really an actual feature in your soil. It's what the lab used, to get your lime recommendation. So the pH is the measure of how much acidity is in the soil. It goes from pretty much 1 to 14, with 7 being neutral. Anything above 7 would be considered alkaline, and anything below 7 is considered acidic. And
what do most of our forages prefer?
well, they like to be right along the little bit acidic side. They like about the 6 to 7 range, 6.4, 6.5 pH range. So there's a little bit of acid, but not a whole lot.
In our realm, we tend to see soils that are more on the acidic side than on the alkaline side. So we wind up doing a lot of recommendations for lime. Right.
Absolutely, yep. In the western part of the state, I know it's, the deeper in the soil profile you get, the soil gets more alkaline, but not with us. The deeper in the soil profile, it gets more acidic. Our rain is naturally acidic, so if you do lime, you're going to have to keep adding lime in our area, Southeast Ohio, probably every 3 or 4 years to keep that pH where it needs to be, right in that sweet zone where the nutrients are available and the plants can thrive.
So what else does pH affect in the soil?
Well, the pH could also affect your microbes in the soil, and my basic philosophy when it comes to growing anything, whether it's garden or pasture, is microbes. I look at it as I am going to foster this microbial environment in the soil, and if I have healthy microbes or organisms, then I'm going to have healthy soil, which correlates to healthy plants. So I like to start down at the microbe stage. So that's my philosophy for everyone: healthy microbes, healthy soil, healthy plants.
And work your way up.
Yes, and I got some more slides here of some pictures. The first one here, this is the Wvu Soil Lab. These pictures were from Dr. James Gorman, assistant professor, who retired in 2015. But this is what happens. So when you get wet soil and you send it to the soil lab, this is the soil lab at WVU, they sit on the counter until it dries. So that's why I tell our clients that I don't ship it until it's wet, because I know when it goes to the soil lab, it's just going to sit on the counter until it dries. So I don't take that time. Here, these boxes here, it doesn't take much soil. Remember, half a cup. And these boxes here that you see, this is the soil after it has been grinded up and passed through a sieve to get rid of any rocks or any other material, organic material that might be in there. Like
roots,
leaves. Absolutely, leaves. And these boxes are about the size of a check box.
Oh.
So they're really not that big. The diameter, the thickness may be a little bit more, but it's really not that big. You can see it. You can see the bottom of the box in there in those pictures as well.
It's interesting, all the different colors too.
Yes, it is very interesting. Yes.
Drastic differences.
And the soil color, we won't talk about, but soil color definitely tells you a lot what's happening. I like my soil to be nice and dark and black because you have a lot of organic matter in the soil. Okay, so here what happens when your soil is at the first thing they do is they test the pH. So this is called a shaker tray, and they got take a little bit of soil out of that box, they put in these little cups, and they'll add some distilled water. And typically at this lab, they would shake it for about 45 minutes. Then once it gets done shaking, 45 minutes to an hour, they take it up and they put the little wand in, and it spits out the pH reading, and they record it, and they move on to the next cup. Okay, here is the nutrient extraction. So now they're getting ready to extract the nutrients from the soil to get the calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay, and here is the piece of equipment that does the extraction, this ICP, inductively coupled plasma spectrometer. So they put the soil in here, and it kind of extracts all the nutrients out. And on your soil test, if you see like a Malic 3, well, this is the process that they're using to extract those nutrients. And then, of course, your final result is they give you your results. And I really like WVU results. They have the nice color codes, so you can look and say, oh, red, I'm low in nutrients, I better add some, or green, I got a lot of that nutrients. So just if you don't really know how to interpret soil results, just by the colors and the bars is a good visual that helps.
Marcus, we know that you're partial to WVU because you went there, right? But just to clarify, Ohio State does not offer soil testing through the university, so it's not that we're shunning our own university.
I prefer to send to Ohio State if we had Ohio State, so maybe we can start that again. I don't know. Who we talk about that?
Yeah. Unfortunately, Ohio State does not have public soil testing services anymore through our university, so we use either other private labs or neighboring university labs.
Penn State or on southeast corner of Ohio, a lot of folks use Penn State. I use Spectrum. I can't use WVU do, because their service is free for residents, so then they don't take outside the state soil samples. So I keep it with Spectrum Analytic at Washington Courthouse, and they do a very good job. I like their information and their reports.
Some of the good news is, and we talk about this when we do our fertilizer certification classes, is that all the labs do a really good job of producing good results. So whatever lab it is you choose to send it to, your results should be reliable, although the display might be different. You may prefer one lab over the other based on the recommendations that you give you or the way it's displayed or the speed. But the actual results themselves from any lab should be pretty reliable, right?
Yes, and there was some research done on that where as a blind study, I think it was kind of about Purdue or OSU, where they sent 13 samples to 13 different labs, and 12 out of 13 all came within acceptable ranges, except for that one lab.
So that's great news.
I wish I knew what that one lab was, though. So, yes, that is really good news.
So moving on, once you get these results back, I see there's a suggestions section at the bottom.
Yes. Yep.
If anybody needs additional explanation, they're welcome to come to see you at the Extension office or whoever your county agent is and get some advice on how to proceed in correcting your soil based on these results.
Absolutely. And typically, you get your results back. Now you know how much lime to add. That's why I like testing in the fall, because you can add the lime in the fall, and that gives that lime to neutralize that acid to get to that sweet zone, that pH over the winter, and hopefully by springtime it's ready to go. Your soil where it needs to be. Typically in pastures, I don't like fertilizing. I don't recommend fertilizing right there at the beginning of the season, because over winter things are breaking down in the soil, so there's this flush of nutrients. So I think the best time to fertilize a pasture would probably be more towards late May for the first time you get your nutrients in there.
And if you're establishing a new crop in your pasture, or even just waiting for the rest to green up, if you fertilize too early, you might not actually be fertilizing the crop you want, but you could be fertilizing your weeds instead. So want to be aware that when you apply the fertilizer is really important for the results you're actually going to get later in the year.
And fighting weeds in a permanent pasture stand is not fun.
We spend a lot of our time helping people do that. So trying to avoid that from the start will save you a lot of time, effort, and money in the long run.
Yes, it will. Let's go back to the slides again real quick. I don't think I have. Let's see. So our grazing management style, talking about the pasture fertility. So even how we graze the crop, can affect the fertility of the pasture. For example, continuous grazing versus rotational grazing. Continuous grazing, your cattle are going to have wide open field. They're going to go where they want to go, whether it's a shade tree, whether it's around close to a creek where they get some water, or a pond. That's where they're going to congregate. That's where they want to be. So the their manure is going to be right around those areas. The concentration of it's going to be in those areas. Whereas rotational grazing, the more paddocks you have, the more nutrients is being spread across the field. And I like to see like 7 to 8 paddocks would be great in a field. You get more disperse of the manure. The cattle are using more, I consider, grass and inventory. So they're utilizing more of that inventory, and you don't have as much waste. As well as when we talk about rotational grazing, soil compaction, which is huge. Soil compaction prevents air and water getting to the roots, and your plants could die. And so that rotational grazing helps prevent that soil compaction by giving maybe a 6-week rest, and it helps your grass to recover. From that 6 weeks rest, has time to regrow and rebuild itself from getting cut off, basically ate off from the animals.
Those all sound like intriguing ways to improve your grazing system and fertility overall. So if somebody is moving from a continuous grazing situation to something that's more intensive, what are some key things they need to do to utilize that type of a system?
Fencing and water. That's the two biggest things. That's, a few years ago I did a research study for my thesis in West Virginia. I surveyed beef producers and to find out what their barriers to rotational grazing was and why they are not using rotational grazing. And the top two was definitely fencing and access to water. So if you're going to switch from continuous grazing to rotational grazing, yes, it's going to cost some investment in the infrastructure. The fencing, the gates, from the water, where you're going to have portable waters that you move, or if you're going to have permanent water stations. So those are the two biggest barriers. But once you get over those barriers and get into a good flow, I think the rotational system comes pretty easy. I think you'll like the results of how your pasture looks. It's just going to look better. It might be work at first up front, but I think towards the end it's not really that hard going out and opening the gate up every 4 or 5 days and put them into a new paddock.
Right, and then thinking from like a financial aspect or also an animal handling aspect, making those investments up front to improve your utilization in the pasture is going to save you both money on fertilizer.
Yes.
Also, it's going to provide you more forage to use throughout the year, so you're less waste.
Less waste.
That means money.
That means more money, and using the rotational grazing, you have a higher stocking rate.
Yeah, so more animals.
So more animals, more money. And
on
I think
the same
that's
set of land.
That's the goal of farming, right? It's fun, it's lifetime, it's a passion, it's a hobby, whatever it is, but at the end of the day, you want to make money.
Yeah, and then when those animals are used to having you out there with them, they should hopefully be easier to handle when it's time to do vaccinations or other health or loading animals and going from one way to another, because they're familiar with you and you don't need to be so aggressive when you're handling them, because you're all friendly now.
Yes.
You've taken that extra time to work with them day to day.
And you're letting the animals become, you're kind of the foreman, and the cattle are kind of your employees, and they're the ones managing the grass by how they're eating it. Maybe they're eating more weeds, so it could cut down on weeds. Hopefully the goal is with the cattle is to kind of keep this grass in a vegetative growth. You don't want the grass to go into a seed head and it loses quality. You don't want to graze it when it's too short because there's just not enough there. So it's like this phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 3 would be the seed head. Phase 2 is where you got lots of leaves, good height from the grass is in that vegetative growth, and that's where you want to try to move your animals on. And then depending on what species of grass you have, move them off to 3-4 inches, and then just keep moving them around. Let them control the height of the grass and keep your grass growing, and spread that manure everywhere and recycle those nutrients, because organic matter is huge for soils as well. And the microbes love it. Healthy microbes, healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy pasture.
Have we talked much about erosion yet, Marcus?
No, we haven't talked too much about erosion, just a little bit of avoiding it, in your soil samples. But, that is a big goal and a big priority and a big benefit of rotational grazing is you have less erosion. The animals are walking the path less and less and less. They always walk up one same path, they can wear it out. And that compaction, and they're tearing up the mud, that could lead to erosion, especially on a hillside. And the next thing you know, you got a big slip happening. So breaking it up, the animals aren't on there maybe once every 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and so you don't quite have the erosion problems, the compaction problems, as you see in a continuous grazing system.
Those all sound like great benefits. So then when it comes to training yourself to be a better manager in those systems, what are the things that you need to think about when you're, okay, I think it's time to move my animals to the next paddock, but I'm not sure. What are the key indicators of knowing when to make the shift?
Well, it's the grass. To me, it's the grass. It's looking at the grass is one time to make the shift. You don't want them to graze the grass down too low. There are tools. There's plate meters you can use. We won't get too much into those. Or pasture sticks that kind of measure how much forage you do have available for the animal. But it's definitely the grass height and keeping an observation on it. Just because you do have them in rotational grazing, I'm talking about this paddock, I'm not going to go, you go be checking on your animals every day, checking the pasture, make sure they do have plenty. If you want to measure, that's a great idea. So it kind of gives you an idea of, okay, this animal eats X amount of forage per day. I got this many animals. I got this much forage left. And so you kind of have some tools to know when you need to move. But yeah, so the grass height is key.
There's some other things that you might want to keep in mind if you're pursuing a management-intensive grazing system. And one of those things we've alluded to it is the time that you spend out there. And any tools that you might need. Really, you'll need your tractor a lot less, but you might want to have like a four-wheeler or side-by-side or something available so that you can get from A to B through those muddy conditions. But it should actually save you a lot of work with your tractor in the long run, because you're doing more with your hands and less with horsepower.
You get the animals trained, and they're going to want to move to the next paddock. You know, they got the fish, they see the fresh grass, they know it's there, they sense it, and when you open that gate, that's where they want to go. Get the nice, tall, delicious, hopefully palatable grass.
One of the issues that we hear a lot about being residents of Ohio is water quality. That's on everybody's mind. And because soil is the #1 contaminant of water, of course we want to implement as much erosion control as possible, and then also make sure that the fertilizers we apply are being utilized correctly. So we want to emphasize the right time, right place, right amount, so that we can utilize our fertilizers to their full potential, and then also minimize our impact downstream. Right.
You said it perfectly.
Well, I think we're about out of time for today's segment, but want to encourage you to contact your local extension office or Marcus and I with any questions that you might have from this episode. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Marcus.
Well, thanks for having me on here, Christine.
It's been enlightening. Stay tuned in future episodes for information about how to measure dry matter, how to measure forage quality, and also how to combat weeds. We'll see you next time.